Okay, this is part 3 of the cardiovascular system, and we are going to learn the heart. All right, the first thing is we're going to start with some tissue and layers, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so the heart is surrounded by a fibrous sac called the pericardium. So none of our organs are just kind of floating around, and they don't touch one another. They're always surrounded by some type of specialized layer or specialized sac. Okay, so the pericardial sac surrounds the entire heart, and here you could see it peeled back. And then, of course, in between the heart and the pericardial sac is pericardial fluid. Okay, so now we're going to look at the layers of the heart. So the heart is made up of 3 layers. Okay, let's start from the outside and work inside. So the outside layer is the epicardium, and epi means around, and it's the outermost layer. Okay, so here what they've done is they've taken a little piece of the heart so we can look at it from a side view. All right, so the epicardium is outside, the outermost layer. Okay, there's a little pericardial cavity, and then this thick layer in the middle is called the myocardium. Myocardium is the cardiac muscle tissue, where this is an actual muscle. It's a specialized muscle, and it's only found in the heart only. And then the inside layer is the endocardium, made up of endothelial tissue. So that's epicardium. It's epithelial and connective tissue. The myocardium is the cardiac muscle. Okay. And the endocardial tissue is endothelial tissue on the inside. Remember, endo means inside. Okay, the heart has a right and a left side. It's made up of 4 chambers, 2 atria and 2 ventricles. All right, if we look over at this picture here, they've done a coronal cut on the heart, and you can see the right atrium. Okay. Then there's a left atrium. Then you'll see a right ventricle down here. Okay. And then a left ventricle. Okay, and a really nice way or easy way to remember this is if you look at this picture, ventricles look like a V. V for ventricle. All right, so that was 2 atria, 2 ventricles, left and right side. So right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Now, in between the right atrium and the right ventricle, so this is technically the right side of the heart, we have a valve that separates the 2 chambers, and same as similar to the left and atrium and the left ventricle, there's also a valve here. All right, now there's 2 names. So let's start with the right. So this valve is known as the right atrial ventricular valve, okay, and or sometimes referred to as the right AV valve, atrioventricular. Okay, now there's also a left, way over here, okay, this little valve right here, that's the left AV valve. Okay, and I'm going to also actually add that over here too. This is the right AV valve. Now notice that these 2 valves are called the atrioventricular valves. However, they also have another name. On the right side, the right AV valve is also called the tricuspid valve. And the left AV valve is often referred to as the mitral valve. And you may have heard that term in TV. They use the mitral and tricuspid terminology more so in the hospital and that sort of thing. But technically, the actual names are the left and right AV valves. And or tricuspid for the right and mitral for the left. All right, so we have two AV valves, okay, and then we have two semilunar valves. All right, the semilunar valves. Let's see here. Let's start with the first one. Okay, see this little kind of this little structure right there that I'm circling? All right, that is one of the semilunar valves, and it's often referred to as the pulmonary valve. And pulmonary means lungs because this valve is going to eventually lead to the lungs. All right, then we have another semilunar valve called the aortic valve. The aortic valve is right here. It's kind of tucked under there. Okay, there's the aortic valve. And it's called the aortic valve because when blood flows through the aortic valve, it's going to move into the aorta, which is over here. All right, so let's recap. The heart has 4 chambers, 2 atria, 2 ventricles. Okay, right atrium, left atrium. Right ventricle, left ventricle. What divides the right ventricle and the right atrium is an AV valve. The right AV valve, also called the tricuspid valve. What divides the left atrium and the left ventricle is the mitral valve, also known as the left AV valve. So you want to know both names. Okay. There's 2 more valves, 2 semilunar valves, and notice the first one is the pulmonary valve, and see how the pulmonary valve is actually inside of the right ventricle? That technically is where it's located. Okay, and then inside of the left ventricle is the aortic valve. All right, very good. Now, it's important to learn the anatomy completely before moving on because in this class and in your anatomy classes, you're going to have to know every part of the heart that we discuss. Now, a good way to learn the heart is to take a blank piece of paper. Actually, I'm sorry, not blank piece of paper. This is an activity that I have posted on Blackboard, and print up this activity and use it to take notes so that you can label all of the parts of the heart. All right, so let's go ahead and start with that. Okay, so anatomy-wise, the first thing that I like to go over is I always start with the superior and inferior vena cava. Okay, so the superior vena cava is right here, and it's the main vein that brings blood to the heart, and it comes from the body. So your body, your venous system is returning blood to the heart, deoxygenated blood to the heart. And the superior vena cava is going to be the main vein into the heart from the upper portion of your body. Then we also have down here the inferior vena cava. Inferior just means that it's below, but it's also going to bring deoxygenated blood from the body. And where does it go from here? They both, superior and inferior vena cava, will deliver blood to the right atrium. All right. the right atrium. Now remember that the heart is a muscle, and so it contracts, and the right atrium will contract and push open the atrioventricular valve, the right AV valve, also known as the tricuspid valve. When that contraction happens, it's going to push open the valve, and blood will move from the right atrium into the right ventricle. Remember, V for ventricle. Okay, now the next step in blood flow through the heart, blood moves into the right ventricle, and of course the ventricle will contract. But before that contraction, all of the blood will come into the ventricle, and this valve is going to close. It's going to close shut so that there's no backflow. So that means that this is a one-way passage and blood cannot go backwards. Okay, so therefore, once blood has moved into the right ventricle will eventually contract, and it's going to push open and move through the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is here. And from that point, it's going to move through our pulmonary trunk, okay, to the lungs. In the lungs very specifically are going to exchange CO2 for O2. So this is deoxygenated blood coming to the lungs. So let's clarify that. Okay, this is deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Okay, and then what happens is the lungs are part of our respiratory system, and their job is to exchange gases. So they're going to exchange CO2 so CO2 is going to go out of the blood and oxygen into the blood. All right, so all of this is kind of happening off screen in the lungs, which is fine. But the fact is that eventually that blood, that oxygenated blood, is going to come back from the lungs. Okay, so it's going to come back from the lungs. And again, CO2 is going to leave. Okay, and what comes in is O2. And this happens naturally by diffusion. Sorry, it looks like a Z, but it's a 2. All right, so oxygenated blood is going to enter the lungs, and it's specifically going to enter through the left pulmonary veins. All right, so let's make a note here. The blood that's coming in is oxygenated, and this is an incredibly important point. Okay, this is also referred to as O2 rich blood. Okay, so what I've written here is O2 rich blood enters via the left and right pulmonary veins, because everything that's happening here on the left side is also happening over here. Okay, didn't work the way I thought it would do. There we go. Okay, so that's also happening on this side. All right, so let me kind of repeat that. So we know that deoxygenated blood is going to come from the pulmonary trunk. Now, the pulmonary trunk goes to the lungs, and it's going to go to the left lung, and we can't see it here because it crosses underneath, but it's also going to move into the right lung and do the same thing in exchange gases. So it's going to exchange CO2 in exchange for O2. This is in the right lung and the left lung simultaneously. Okay, and now once oxygen-rich blood re-enters the heart, of course it's going to re-enter from the left and right here. There's the right, left pulmonary veins. And where does it go next? It goes from both sides. It's going to enter right into the right atrium, right here. It's going to come from this side, and technically it's going to come also from this side and dump into the left atrium. Okay, so now we have oxygen-rich blood in the left atrium, and it's time to take that oxygen-rich blood and get it back to the body, and that is the next step. Okay, so oxygen-rich blood will move from the left atrium into the left ventricle. However, when it does so, it has to cross the left AV valve, also known as the mitral valve. So that once it passes the valve, that valve will close it back up. Okay, and all of the blood now is in the left ventricle. Okay, in the left ventricle, ventricles contract, and as soon as the ventricle contracts, it's going to push through and move across the aortic semilunar valve here, and that aortic semilunar valve leads, of course, to the aorta. So blood will leave the left ventricle, cross the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, and the aorta will contract, and blood can leave the aorta to the body. Now this is oxygen-rich blood that's moving, that's going to enter the arterial system, all of the arteries. Eventually that aorta connects to all of the major arteries, and it's going to allow the body to deliver O2-rich blood to the body. Now, I want you to recap that and make sure you have the full anatomy of this heart down. Quickly, let's actually go through one more thing that I haven't discussed. See this middle part? That is called the septum of the heart. And there's actually a little bit more anatomy, but for now, I want you to learn this inside and out and the pathway of blood flow through the heart. Okay, which is also referred to as the pulmonary circuit. So we know that blood is going to come from the body, and we know that veins carry oxygen-poor blood towards the heart. Okay, and blood will enter the right atrium, and it's going to come from the inferior and superior vena cava. And it will go from the right atrium to the right ventricle. Don't forget which valve is here. Remember, this is the right AV valve that it's going to cross. Okay, and also known as the tricuspid valve, right? Then it'll move to the right ventricle. Okay, then it's going to move through, from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk. Of course, it's going to have to pass the pulmonary semilunar valve. from the pulmonary trunk, it goes to the the lungs, where blood is oxygenated, where oxygen is exchanged with CO2 inside of the lungs. Okay, then oxygenated blood from the lungs will re-enter the heart through the pulmonary veins. And that's both the right pulmonary vein right here and the left pulmonary vein right here. And they both connect. This is a good picture because it shows how they both connect to the left atrium, and they will indeed deliver blood to the left atrium. Now this pathway is called the pulmonary circuit. Okay, which leads us to the next circuit, which is the systemic circuit. Okay, so the systemic circuit is in reference to the circulation of blood to the body. So, all right, let me just explain here. Basically, as we very well know, the oxygenated blood that comes from the aorta, okay, is going to lead to all of our branching arteries, arterioles. Eventually, it'll hit the capillaries. And what do the capillaries do? They deliver oxygen to every single tissue and cell in the entire body. And in exchange, they're going to pick up CO2. So here we can see that very clearly. Here's our person, okay? And the systemic system is going to deliver oxygen-rich blood to all of the tissues. And then it's going to take oxygen-poor, aka CO2-rich blood, up to the vena cavas and to the right atrium. And this is the pathway of the systemic circuit.
The heart has 4 hollow chambers, the left and right ventricle and the left and right atrium. Each chamber has a different function. The right atrium receives oxygen-depleted blood and empties it into the right ventricle. This blood then flows to the lungs for gas exchange. Oxygenated blood from the lungs enters the left atrium and empties into the left ventricle. From there, it flows out of the heart into the arteries of systemic circulation to distribute oxygen throughout the body.